Hello, everybody. Another question for the yes or no treatment. Uh, this one involves, well, the endlessly entertaining saga of Donald Trump. And the question is, will Trump be reelected in 2024? Now, Trump's incumbency as the 45th President of the United States wasn't enough for him, and so he wants to become the 47th President of the United States after the 46th President, Joe Biden, leaves office. So his plan is, of course, to not allow Joe Biden to get reelected either, but to become the president once again. Now, the 22nd Amendment to the U.S. Constitution I think it was in the 1950s, early 1950s, allows for a president to be reelected, but only once, and it doesn't have to be in consecutive terms. And there was a custom in the old days of the Republic that you only served 2 terms. In fact, I suppose that was started by George Washington, who declined to run for a 3rd term. And it has been it was sort of informally honored by every president since then until Franklin Roosevelt. And he was elected not only for 3 terms, but for a 4th. He died very shortly after his election to his 4th term. And politicians, I think, on both sides of the aisle decided, that wasn't a good thing. So they decided to amend the Constitution to prevent that from happening again. So nobody can have more than 2 terms, including Donald. But he wants one, apparently. Well, maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. So let's just kind of look into this. And needless to say, like few before him and like few questions that I've really addressed in this series of videos, there are fervent views on both sides. So let's look at those who would say, yes, Donald Trump will be reelected in 2024. What are some of the reasons that people say this? Well, first of all, they point out that he was successful in getting himself elected president 4 years ago. Now, he may have just barely failed to get reelected, although many claim that he was even cheated out of his reelection. But in any case, it's no small accomplishment to get yourself elected President of the United States, and Donald Trump did that. So he demonstrates that he has the knowledge and skills and perseverance and so forth to get the job done. So that's a good reason to believe that he is certainly capable of doing it again. The second thing is that Donald, as a kind of promoter, as a very flamboyant businessman in the real estate business, is the master of the soundbite. He has come up with all of these wonderful phrases to describe his progress in the White House. He, of course, had this campaign slogan, "Make America Great Again." Another one that he's working in right now is "Stop the Steal." The idea of the election having been stolen from him. We all know that while he was in the midst of his campaign, he was going to drain the swamp. He didn't do that, by the way, but nonetheless, that was a great slogan. And then now he is operating with a new one called "Save America." Save America. Now, I would guess it's a bit tricky to pull that one off because, of course, what we're saving America from is his presidency. But nonetheless, "Save America" is the current slogan to energize his supporters for his next shot at the White House. So he's a sloganeer, a very good one at it. He certainly commands the attention of the press and that of his very impassioned followers. Next, the bookies who address themselves to such matters are saying he is a hands-down favorite to get the Republican nomination for the presidency in the election year in 2024, and so he will doubtlessly be the nominee. And so the only question then is whether or not he can beat whoever the opponent is. Highly likely to be Kamala, the newly vice president-elect. So we shall see about that. Next, for those who believe that it might be a very difficult and unconventional accomplishment for someone to be out of office and then come back and become the president again, he cites the example of Grover Cleveland, who did that very thing. Grover Cleveland came in 1885, and then after having been out, came back in again and was finally finished his presidency in 1897. So there is a precedent for the very thing that Donald's talking about. So that it makes it seem a little bit less odd, and will kind of calm any fears that people might have about whether or not it's a crazy idea. And finally, he appears to have raised a lot of money, perhaps several $100 million in anticipation of his campaign. His followers are still impassioned, and of course he has a lot of influential people, people with deep pockets who view Donald as being their best bet at retaining their wealth, perhaps. And so he's got that going for him as well. So all in all, what we have is a situation where Donald Trump has a real shot at the presidency in 2024, and if he chooses to take it, highly likely to be elected. Okay, well now, what about the negatives? The people say, no, he won't be the president of the United States, no chance. Well, point number one here is that by dangling the prospect of his running again, not perhaps having confirmed it, nobody even knows if when he says he is running, whether he will even continue, because he's a kind of unpredictable and somewhat a chap with kind of ephemeral ideas, changes his mind from one day to the next depending on which way the wind is blowing, etc., etc. But in the process of dangling this process, he's making it very difficult for other Republicans who themselves want not only to have a shot at campaigning, like his vice president, former mayor of New Jersey, Chris Christie, who knows? There are a lot of others out there that would like their chance. And by his behaving and presenting this uncertain but possible shot at the presidency, he's getting in their way and preventing them from raising money in advance and starting kind of the whole campaign rolling. So that will be very offensive to a lot of people, and perhaps even to the old guard of the Republican Party, that he's himself proving to be an obstacle rather than the great hope of the party. That will engender a lot of opposition and a lot of anger, and Trump, at least to a reasonable extent, needs the support of the party in order to be reelected, and so this argument suggests that he won't have it. Trump cites the example of Grover Cleveland, but there are some big differences. Grover Cleveland actually won the popular vote. This is part of the peculiarity of the Electoral College and the popular vote differences. Grover Cleveland actually won the popular vote 3 times, and Donald has not won the popular vote once. Next, I'm not so sure about Donald's health. You may remember the famous doctor's letter where the doctor reported on his annual medical examination, which Donald wrote. This is just unbelievable, and kind of got caught at that. So one suspects that there are some, perhaps some issues rumbling along in the background. Plus, he is overweight, perhaps even obese. And for a man, who will be 78 years old at the time of the next election, that's not good news. So there's some issues there. He might not even be able to run at that stage, and would certainly be confronting some serious problems as a man in his 80s were he to be elected. So I think that's a reason to think not only that it wouldn't be wise to elect him, but that he won't even be in a position to run. Also, there is a question about how serious Donald is about doing any of this anyway. As Oscar Wilde once said, the only thing that's worse than being talked about is not being talked about. For Donald, the one thing that he probably fears more than anything else is to be out of the public eye, to be irrelevant, to be forgotten, and especially to be a loser. And of course, by keeping himself in front of the public eye, he kind of puts off the day when he will be exposed as a liar and kind of yesterday's man. That's something he really couldn't stand. So that suggests that this whole business about having a go at the 2024 election may be just something to keep him in the limelight. Next, Kamala, the vice president-elect, is a very smart, tough lady, former attorney general of the state of California. And should it come to 2024 in presidential debates, I would guess that she would tear him apart. He simply wouldn't be up to that level of toughness and intellectual rigor, which I'm afraid to say Joe Biden does not possess. And as a consequence, even if he got that far, he probably could get the nomination if he wanted it. He would get killed in the election because of his performance in debates. There is an expectation that Donald may initiate his campaign on the day of the inauguration of President-elect Biden. That would be a truly tasteless and offensive thing to do. And Donald is so narcissistic that he doesn't realize how greatly that would offend many people among the voting public in America, as well as world leaders. It would make him more than ever a pariah. Now, to some extent, he revels in this, but this could really, really stop him in his tracks. And then finally, and last but not least, Trump faces a tidal wave of legal action when he gets out of office. Some of which is criminal, some of which is civil, but Trump could easily wind up in jail as a consequence of particularly those actions being taken against him by the New York District Attorney. And having to do with tax evasion, fraud, money laundering, and so forth. Some pretty serious stuff there. Of course, he will have the best of lawyers, but the authorities have awfully good lawyers as well. They got Weinstein in prison, they got Jeffrey in prison, they got Ghislaine in prison, and so forth. So, he's not going to necessarily have an easy ride of it. Could wind up in jail. And even for his most fervent admirers, that would be a bit hard to take. So, in sum, there's quite a long list of reasons to think that his prospects as a plausible presidential candidate in 2024 just don't hold water. He just won't. He won't be able to pull it off. Well, thinking about that, what's my take? I may, if you will indulge me, like to use a literary allusion. There is a much admired, famous, so-called children's book in England, much admired by adults as well, called Wind in the Willows by the author Kenneth Grahame. And it has a wonderful series of animal characters into it, most notably a narcissistic toad. And this toad thinks really of nothing but glorifying himself. He continues to make up untrue stories about his own history, his own performance, his own skills. He lives in a big house. He eventually gets caught and gets in real trouble with the law and is removed from the house. The house is taken over by unfriendly forces, in this case, weasels and ferrets and stoats. And then his friends band together to help him get back into the house. And after all of that, he still is unwilling really to accept that he isn't really the most talented, intelligent, successful person around, and kind of ignores the fact that they helped him. But at the very end, he seems to kind of have acquiesced. Well, this story of Toad, this is Trump all over. And I think the moral of the story is that you can get away with exploiting friends, exploiting your followers to a certain extent, but eventually they lose patience with it and it runs out of time. And there he is. Trump is so dreadful that all of this is eventually going to catch up with him if he even gets as far as running for that wonderful office. So he's not going to make it. Okay, well, hope you enjoyed that. If so, the usual thing. Give me a like, subscribe, comment, hit the notification bell, and thanks a lot. And I'll see you at the next one. Bye-bye.